One of the most savage queens to have ever ruled England was Mary I. She became known as Bloody Mary, as she burned over 200 Protestants at the stake during her short 5-year reign of the country. She was the eldest child of King Henry VIII, and many believed that she was as brutal as her father could be. But she was a woman who was driven by her religious convictions. She was also a very sick woman, and throughout her life she encountered a number of health problems that led to her dying at the age of 42. One of the biggest issues that plagued Mary was her inability to become pregnant, and she blamed Protestants on this, and that's why she punished them extremely harshly. But on the 17th of November 1558, inside the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Mary I died, and it would be her half-sister Elizabeth who would succeed her. But what is the story of the death of Mary I? Now Mary wrote in 1552 to the council of her half-brother, King Edward VI, and she said, "My health is more unstable than that of any creature, and I have all the greater need to rejoice in the testimony of a pure conscience." It's likely that Mary's health throughout her life was impacted by the huge amount of stress she was put under, even during her early life. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was the first wife of King Henry VIII, and she had a sharp but very distressing downfall. Henry VIII, Mary's father, had fallen for Anne Boleyn at a much younger woman who served as Mary's lady-in-waiting. However, he needed a petition to Rome to get a divorce. This would not be granted, and Henry later decided to declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and banished Catherine, Mary's mother, from her household. Catherine was banned from seeing Mary, her daughter, and the pair would not see each other again. Catherine of Aragon was heartbroken by being prevented from seeing Mary, and this caused her great upset. But Mary was profoundly affected by this. She lived on a diet of stress and nervous tension, and this did not make her very well. She was a thin and frail lady who had red hair and very fair complexion. She allegedly had a loud and deep voice and was rather short-sighted and struggled to see. She also had her father's temper and could be very stubborn. It's believed that as an infant her health was nothing out of the ordinary, and she lived a comfortable life in the royal nursery and was given a brilliant education. But in Spain, 1528, she suffered from a bout of smallpox, but emerged from this rather positively. It wasn't recorded that she was scarred from smallpox, unlike her half-sister Elizabeth I was, but when she entered puberty around the age of 14, Mary began to suffer greatly. She complained of many pains from her head and also her stomach, and there were many occasions where she constantly was sick for periods of up to 2 weeks. She could not keep any food down, and as she was Henry VIII's daughter, the best royal doctors would tend to her, and different physicians and apothecaries were brought in to treat her. Mary was diagnosed with something recorded as strangulation of the womb, and this had a number of symptoms, including issues with her periods, a depressed mental state, issues with breathing, and pain and swelling of the abdomen. Because of this, she also suffered from headaches, lack of appetite, fainting, nausea, and vomiting. This was all incredibly stressful for the young girl, who was having to deal with much despite being a young girl. She had also been written out of the line of succession, which would have affected her. By right, she should have succeeded Henry VIII, but she was written out because of the dissolution of Henry's marriage with her mother. Mary later went to live with her half-sister Elizabeth, and as part of her treatment she often rode on horseback, but she was then in a sense kept under house arrest, as the Act of Succession banishing her from the throne was passed. She was practically held under house arrest, and Mary was ordered not to call herself a princess or label her mother as a queen, and she was threatened with execution and a stay inside of the Tower in London if she did this. However, weeks before her 19th birthday she became very ill. She was placed under the care of Lady Shelton, whose treatment of her in a sense was very harsh. Mary had headaches and stomach cramps again, and Lady Shelton fetched an apothecary who was new in. She was prescribed a number of pills which actually made Mary much worse, and they made her fight for her life. She could have had an allergic reaction to what was inside of them, or some response which placed her body into a state of shock, but Lady Shelton was worried that she would be accused of trying to poison the king's eldest child, and she worried that she would go to the executioner's block. Even some of the royal doctors refused to treat her, as they did not want to be blamed or linked to her death if she died under their charge, but Thomas Cromwell then sent the king's personal doctor, Dr. Butts, to see Mary. He said that her illness was curable and that she needed to take a course of careful treatment, and that if she had been living in better conditions, then she would have been healthier. Henry refused to relent, but Mary did get better. She was given a special diet and she then did recover, but her illness showed no pattern, and each time she was poorly, the severity of symptoms changed. Many across the land learned about her illness, and European princes and monarchs were hesitant to ask the king to marry Mary, for her health would be such a burden to them. She wrote to Cromwell again and complained again of more issues with her stomach and head, but she did return to her father's household, and she served as the chief mourner for Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, at her funeral. But she had very bad toothache, and this was then pulled out. She was severely ill in the winter of 1557, and she was so sick that she could not stand or sit for long, and she became very faint. She also then, a few years later, had a fever that caused her heart palpitations, and she was so ill that many thought she was on death's door. It took her a while to recover, but she got there. She would accompany Henry VIII and his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, on their honeymoon, but she then got sick and returned back for the comfort of home. She experienced more fever in 1547, and her mood and mental state got much worse. After her father's death and the accession of Edward VI, Mary was stressed yet again. She, as Catholic, was worried that her half-brother, who was Protestant, could have her killed, and she lived under the constant fear of imprisonment. But Mary would become queen herself, after deposing Edward's successor, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. But she then married Philip of Spain on the 25th of July 1554, which did not go down well. People across England feared his Spanish influence, but the most tragic bout of illness would then strike Mary. After the wedding, at the age of 37, she announced she was pregnant. Mary's health got better during pregnancy, but she then went into confinement at Hampton Court. However, there was an announcement on the streets on the 30th of April 1555 that she had given birth to a child, but this was a mistake, and the doctor said there was a miscalculation of her due date. Mary said she was pregnant and insisted on this, but she became very reclusive. Not many courtiers and attendants believed her, and those who waited on her said she looked pale and ill. But she later came round to the fact there was no child, and then the swelling of her belly went down. This was a phantom pregnancy, and Philip then left England to leave Mary to rule her kingdom. He did return, but Mary was yet again ill, with insomnia and melancholy. It was said that the stress of her life made her look 10 years older than she was. But when Philip left England for the last time, Mary believed she was pregnant again, and her stomach was swollen. Mary recovered, but in the January of 1558, England lost Calais to France, and there was great famine across the country, as weather was awful and had ruined crops. There was also a terrible bout of flu which was sweeping through England and was killing people at the same rate as the plague. This illness was one that lingered on, and then the victim would often die. In spring and summer of 1558, Mary was sick again, and in the August she had a low fever and dropsy, and it was said she was in a very bad way. The royal doctors predicted that she would die. Because of this, she moved from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace. Then by September of 1558, Mary had a high fever again, confusion and also headaches, and she then went almost completely blind. She had a fever which would last days, and more bad moods made her feel worse. But by October, it was clear she would not recover, and she made her will. Mary tried to do what she could to rule England, but it was clear to everyone she did not have long left. In early November she did seem to get a little better, and she then named Elizabeth, her half-sister, her successor. She then drifted in and out of consciousness and would wait for her death. She got very weak, and many of her household staff switched to go and serve Elizabeth I to try and secure a place in the new Queen-to-be's household. But some servants stayed loyal to Mary, and they tended to her in her final moments. She prayed for her salvation, and she described these incredible dreams she was having whilst she was unconscious. She said she saw angels before her, and this gave her comfort. She heard Mass in the early part of the 17th of November 1554, but then she died peacefully between 4 and 5 in the morning. There have been a number of suggestions as to what killed Mary, and one of them is that she suffered from ovarian dropsy. This condition is where cysts form on the ovaries, and it creates terrible abdominal pains and swelling, and it can be linked to the growth of cancerous tumours. Another theory that had been put forward is that she suffered from a tumour of the pituitary gland, and it was said that some women diagnosed with this can have problems with depression, bleeding, and issues with stomach pains. But it has also been suggested that the violent bout of flu which was sweeping through England could have caused her death. But Mary I was a queen who, despite reigning for just 5 years, had a huge impact on the landscape of England. She restored Catholicism briefly, and launched a campaign of persecution against her enemies. But she was a woman who had a lot to deal with in her life, and she became incredibly stressed at her father's treatment of her mother. But she had a number of issues with her health over the years that in no doubt contributed to her death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.